The king's impossible decision. The grand palace of Zalfar Prime stood like a mountain of black stone, stretching into the stormy sky. Inside, on a throne of dark metal, sat King Zorvac, ruler of the most feared empire in the galaxy. His golden eyes burned with fury as he glared down at the trembling alien healers before him. "You are telling me," the king growled, his deep voice echoing through the chamber, "that my only daughter is worthless." The head healer flinched. "Your Majesty, Princess Vena is unable to bear children. We have checked her in every possible way. There is no cure. She is useless," the king finished coldly. A heavy silence filled the room. Every Zalfar noble and warrior present lowered their heads, afraid to speak. The king's anger was legendary. Entire planets had burned because of his wrath. Vena, standing near the throne, said nothing. Her silver-blue skin was pale, her purple eyes dark with pain, but she refused to let a single tear fall. She had always known she was different, weaker. Now, the whole empire knew. The king clenched his fists. The Zalfar Empire was built on strength and legacy. Every ruler passed their bloodline to the next generation. A royal heir must be born. There was no other way. But now his daughter, his only child, had failed him. Zorvac took a deep breath, his sharp claws tapping against the throne's armrest. There had to be a solution. He could not simply cast her aside like a common servant. That would make him look weak. But keeping her here, a constant reminder of failure, was unacceptable. Then an idea formed in his mind. A cruel, perfect idea. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. "Very well," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "If my daughter cannot serve me, she will serve another purpose." The nobles shifted uneasily. What was he planning? The king leaned forward. "I will offer my daughter as a gift to the human alliance." Gasps filled the throne room. The Zalfar saw humans as weak creatures, short-lived, fragile, and powerless. Giving a Zalfar princess to a human, it was an insult. Vena's breath caught in her throat. A human. Her people barely considered them worth noticing. Now she was to be sent away, exiled, given to some human stranger. "My lord," one noble finally spoke, stepping forward hesitantly. "Surely, there is another way." The king's gaze turned sharp as a blade. "Do you question my decision?" The noble lowered his head at once. "No, your majesty." King Zorvac smirked. "Of course not." His word was law. He turned to his daughter. "You will leave tomorrow. You will be wed to a human. Do not shame me further." Vena's heart pounded, but she kept her face blank. She had no choice. She was no longer a princess. She was nothing. The king waved a hand. "Take her away." Two Zalfar guards stepped forward. They did not need to drag her. She walked on her own, her head high, her back straight. But inside, she felt hollow. As she left the throne room, whispers followed her. A princess, given to a human. What a disgrace. Better if she had never been born. The doors closed behind her, and she was gone. A new fate awaits. Aboard a grand Zalfar warship, Vena sat in silence. Outside the window, the stars blurred past. Her entire life had been in the palace, cold, strict, and full of duty. And now, she was leaving it behind forever. She had never met a human before. She had seen them in reports, short creatures, their faces soft, their lifespans barely a blink compared to Zalfar centuries. They were strange, but they were also resilient. Her father had given her away as a punishment, a final insult. But perhaps there was something waiting for her on that distant planet. The thought was small, fragile, but it was hope. And for the first time in her life, Princess Vena allowed herself to hope. The unexpected bond. The shuttle landed with a soft hiss on a floating human space station, Nova Haven. It was smaller than the grand Zalfar cities Vena had known, yet it thrived with life in ways her homeworld never had. Humans bustled about, their movements quick and energetic, their eyes filled with something alien to her people. Warmth. She stood at the edge of the shuttle's ramp, her posture rigid, her sharp violet eyes scanning the crowd. She did not belong here. And yet, she had no choice. A human man stepped forward, dressed in a neat yet simple uniform. His hair was dark brown, slightly messy, his face kind but cautious. Unlike the humans who whispered and stared, his gaze did not hold fear. He was Ethan Carter, a scientist, chosen by the Human Alliance to be her husband. The idea of marriage between their species was ridiculous, but the Alliance had agreed to the Salfar King's offer, more out of political necessity than genuine belief in the match. Humans had always sought peace with the Salfar, and this was a way to prove it. Ethan, however, had not expected this. He had imagined the Salfar princess as cold, arrogant, maybe even cruel. What he saw instead was something else entirely. A woman who looked like she carried the weight of an empire on her shoulders. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan extended his hand. Welcome. Vena stared at his hand, as if it were a foreign object. The Salfar did not touch humans unless necessary. Yet here she was, about to be bound to one in the most personal way. She did not take his hand. Instead, she inclined her head ever so slightly. Where will I be staying? Ethan hesitated but withdrew his hand, trying not to let the rejection sting. I have quarters prepared for you. Follow me. She did. A silent home. The apartment Ethan had been given was spacious, at least by human standards. It was clean, well kept, but empty. No grand throne rooms, no servants, no whispers of nobles watching her every move. Just silence. Ethan cleared his throat. So, I know this is weird. I mean, you didn't exactly choose this, and neither did I. Vena placed a hand on the smooth metal table, feeling its cool surface beneath her fingers. You did not want this either. Ethan let out a small chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. Not exactly. I mean, I wasn't looking to get married to anyone, let alone an alien princess. Something flickered in Vena's eyes. Then why did you accept? Ethan hesitated, then sighed. Because I believe in understanding. Our people don't trust each other. I thought, maybe this could help change that. Besides, I figured you deserved someone who wouldn't treat you like a political pawn. Vena's fingers tightened on the table. That was exactly what she was. I see. Her voice was unreadable, but something in her shoulders seemed less tense. Ethan studied her carefully. She was nothing like the reports he had read on the Salfar. The way she carried herself, the way she avoided eye contact but remained constantly aware. It wasn't arrogance. It was defense. A woman who had spent her life being watched, judged, and discarded. He sighed. Look, I know you probably don't care what I think, but I don't see you as some failed princess. I don't know what your people told you, but if you're here, then you're here. No need to prove anything to me. Vena blinked, her gaze snapping to his. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. The Salfar always judged her. They called her broken, weak, worthless. Yet this human, this stranger, saw none of that. She turned away, but Ethan caught something. The tiniest shift in her expression. He didn't press further. For now, an unexpected illness. Days passed, and Vena remained distant. She did not speak much unless necessary. She ate alone, slept alone, and only interacted with Ethan when required. Yet, small things changed. She began observing human customs, the way they laughed freely, the way they spoke with emotion rather than duty. It was foreign to her, yet strangely intriguing. And then it happened. One evening, as Ethan was working late in his lab, he heard a crash from the other room. His heart jumped as he rushed out, only to find Vena collapsed on the floor, trembling. Vena. He knelt beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly. Hey, what's wrong? Can you hear me? She tried to speak, but her breath was shallow. Her skin, usually a smooth silver blue, looked paler. Ethan didn't hesitate. He scooped her up and carried her to the medical bay. The human doctors were hesitant. Most had never treated Exalthar before, but Ethan was relentless. He ran scans, checking everything he could. Then, as he stared at the results, his blood ran cold. This wasn't an illness. This was something else. Something impossible. The unbelievable truth. The sterile white glow of the medical bay hummed softly as Ethan stared at the screen in front of him. His hands were clenched, his breath uneven. The readings didn't make sense. They couldn't make sense. Princess Vena, the Salfar woman his people barely understood, the woman whose father had cast her away for being infertile. She was pregnant. Ethan blinked. He checked the data again. Blood work, genetic scans, hormonal levels. It was all right there. It wasn't a mistake. His heart pounded. This wasn't just a personal shock. It was a scientific impossibility. Human and Salfar genetics weren't compatible. Every study, every test, every medical log from both species had stated the same thing. Hybrid children were impossible. Their DNA was too different. And yet, life was growing inside her. He turned to look at Vena. She lay on the medical bed, her face pale, her normally strong posture weakened. Despite her unconscious state, she looked almost peaceful, as if something deep inside her had changed. Ethan took a slow breath. He had two choices: report this to the Human Alliance and the Salfar High Council immediately, or protect her and figure out what was happening. He didn't even hesitate. He chose her, waking to the impossible. Vena's eyelids fluttered open, and the sharp, sterile scent of the medical bay filled her senses. She was lying down, a soft warmth pressed against her skin. The dim lights cast Ethan's shadow over her as he sat nearby, watching her carefully. She tried to sit up, but Ethan reached out. "Take it easy." Her gaze sharpened. What happened? Ethan hesitated. He couldn't just tell her. How could he? The news was too massive, too unreal. "You collapsed," he said carefully. "I ran some tests to make sure you were okay." Vena frowned, her body still feeling unfamiliar. Something was different. She could feel it, like a quiet hum in her veins. And Ethan hesitated for a beat too long. Vena's eyes narrowed. "You're hiding something." Ethan sighed. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. If he told her, would she believe him? Finally, he chose honesty. "You're pregnant." Silence. The words hung between them, heavy, impossible. Vena blinked. Then, slowly, she sat up fully. Her arms curled slightly around her abdomen, as if instinctively shielding herself. "That's not possible." Ethan nodded. "That's what I thought too. But the tests don't lie." She stared at him, her breath steady but slow. "Humans and Salfar can't reproduce." "I know." Vena's heart pounded. A mix of emotions surged within her: fear, disbelief, anger, and something else. A tiny flicker of hope. All her life, she had been told she was broken, that she could never create life, that she was a failure to her people, to her father, to her bloodline. But here, in this strange human world, something had changed. Something impossible had happened. Ethan studied her carefully. "Vena, I don't know what this means. For you, for your people, for any of us. But I need you to trust me. I won't let anything happen to you." Vena's fingers curled against the blanket beneath her. Trust. She had never trusted anyone before. Not truly. But something in Ethan's voice, in his steady gaze, made her want to believe him. Slowly, she nodded. The fear of truth. But the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. Ethan spent days running more tests, trying to understand how this was happening. Was it a mutation? A genetic anomaly? A result of her exile? There were no answers, only more questions. And worse, word was spreading. It started as whispers. Doctors, scientists, officials. Some of them noticed the restricted access to medical files. Others had overheard fragments of Ethan's conversations. And then someone reported it. It wasn't humans who found out first. It was the Xalfar. The news reached the High Council, and within hours it was on its way to King Zorvak himself. When the king received the message, his golden eyes darkened. He rose from his throne, his powerful claws curling into fists. His daughter, his disgraced, infertile daughter, was carrying a child of two worlds. And that, to him, was a threat. The message from the king. Ethan and Vena sat together in the dimly lit apartment, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken fears. Then the message came. The screen flickered to life, and there, in the form of a hologram, stood King Zorvak. His face was unreadable, his expression carved from stone. "Princess Vena," he said, his voice laced with quiet fury, "you will return to Xalfar Prime. Immediately." Vena's blood turned cold. The king's gaze flickered to Ethan. "And the human will be dealt with." The transmission cut. Silence fell between them. Ethan let out a slow breath. "Well, that's not good." Vena stood, her posture stiff, her jaw clenched. She had been raised to obey her father's commands, to return, to submit, to let him control her fate. But this time, she pressed a hand over her abdomen. This time, she had something to fight for. She turned to Ethan, her expression hard as steel. "We can't stay here," she said. "We have to run." Ethan nodded. "Then let's go." And just like that, the hunt began. The king's wrath. The dark void of space stretched endlessly outside the small human outpost where Ethan and Vena hid. The metal corridors were dimly lit, the air thick with tension. Outside, the human alliance's defense fleet patrolled the perimeter, unaware of the storm that was coming. Inside their quarters, Vena sat in silence, her fingers curled over her abdomen, feeling the warmth beneath her palm. It was still too early to sense movement, but she felt the life growing inside her. She had never thought this would be possible, never dreamed of it. She had spent her whole life believing she was broken, a failure to her people. And yet here she was. Her father would never accept this child, and that meant he would never let them live. A soft sigh pulled her from her thoughts. Ethan stood near the window, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the distant stars. He had barely slept since the king's message arrived. He knew what was coming. "You're thinking too much," Ethan said without turning. Vena exhaled slowly. "And you're thinking too little." Ethan glanced at her, his lips twitching in the smallest hint of a smile. "I think enough to know we're in trouble." Vena's gaze dropped to the floor. "He will come for us. He will not stop." "I know." Ethan's voice was softer now. He walked over and knelt before her, resting a hand on her knee. "But we're not alone. The human alliance is no match for my father's wrath." Ethan fell silent. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong. But he knew she wasn't. The Xalfar Empire was one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy. One fleet could reduce this outpost to ashes. And soon, they would come. The arrival of death. It happened without warning. A blaring siren ripped through the station. The emergency lights flashed red, casting sharp shadows on the walls. Ethan and Vena barely had time to react before a voice echoed through the comms. "Unidentified ships approaching. Xalfar warships detected. Multiple vessels inbound. Shields at maximum power." Ethan's stomach dropped. Vena's breath hitched. "He's here." Ethan ran to the console, his fingers flying over the controls. A live feed from the station's outer defenses flickered onto the screen. And there in the endless black of space, they saw it. A Xalfar war fleet. Massive ships, black as obsidian, blotting out the stars. Their weapons pulsed with energy, a silent promise of destruction. At the front of the fleet was the royal flagship. And inside, Vena knew, sat her father. A transmission came through. The screen flickered. Then King Zorvac appeared. His golden eyes burned with fury, his powerful form draped in royal armor. "You will surrender." His voice was ice-cold, filled with command. "Return my daughter. Kill the human. Give me the child." Vena's hands clenched into fists. He didn't even call it his grandchild. To him, this was nothing but an abomination. The disgrace. Ethan's voice was calm but firm. "That's not happening." King Zorvac's lips curled in disgust. "Do you think your pathetic human fleet can stop me?" The station's commander stepped into the transmission. A hardened human general, his face scarred from battle. "We don't surrender people to tyrants." The king's gaze darkened. "Then you will all burn." The transmission cut out, and the battle began. The battle for survival. The Xalfar warships opened fire. Bright streaks of energy rained down on the outpost, colliding with the human shields in violent explosions. The entire station shook, alarms screaming as the force of impact sent tremors through the floors. Ethan grabbed Vena's arm. "We need to get out of here." She didn't resist. There was no time. Through the narrow corridors they ran, dodging between panicked soldiers and flashing emergency lights. The station's defenses fired back, but they were outnumbered. The Xalfar fleet was too strong. A voice crackled through the comms. "Hull breach on Deck 7. Evacuate all civilians." Ethan swore under his breath. "They're tearing us apart." They reached the escape bay. A few ships were still docked, soldiers rushing to help evacuate. But Vena's mind was racing. This wasn't just a battle. This was a message. Her father hadn't come just to take her back. He had come to make an example out of them, to show the entire galaxy what happened to those who defied him. She couldn't let that happen. "Ethan," she said, turning to him. Her voice was steady. "I have to go to him." Ethan's eyes widened. "Are you insane? If I don't, he will destroy this station. He will kill everyone." Ethan clenched his jaw. His fist shook, but he knew she was right. She was the only thing the king wanted. But that didn't mean he had to like it. "Fine." His voice was tight. "But you're not going alone." She hesitated. "Ethan." "No. If you're going, I'm going. I won't let him take you. Not without a fight." For a moment, Vena just stared at him. Ethan wasn't a warrior. He was a scientist, a man who had no place standing against an empire. And yet, he was choosing to fight for her. For them. A slow, shaky breath left her lips. She nodded. They stepped onto the last remaining escape shuttle, and together they flew toward the Xalfar flagship, toward the king, toward the final confrontation. The escape. The shuttle hurtled through the black void of space, its engines burning bright against the backdrop of chaos. Ethan gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles white. Every muscle in his body was tense as he steered the small craft toward the Xalfar flagship, dodging debris and incoming fire. Behind him, Vena stood rigid, her heart pounding. The human outpost was in ruins. Explosions lit up the darkness, the shockwaves sending ripples through space. The human alliance fleet was outnumbered, its ships barely holding back the superior Xalfar war vessels. The battle was already lost. And yet, Vena knew this wasn't about war. This was about her. Her father had come to reclaim her, to erase this disgrace from his legacy, to destroy everything she had found in this new life. And Ethan, he was risking everything to stand beside her. She reached for his shoulder, her fingers barely brushing against his jacket. He didn't flinch, didn't look away from the controls, but she felt the tension in his body ease, just slightly. "This is a mistake," she murmured. Ethan let out a breathless laugh. "Yeah. Well, I tend to make a lot of those." She stared at him for a long moment. No human had ever stood for her. No one had ever defied her father for her. Until now. And she wasn't sure how to feel about that. Boarding the enemy's throne. The shuttle landed with a harsh thud inside the docking bay of the Salfar flagship. The massive interior was lined with towering alien warriors, their weapons glowing with lethal energy. As soon as the ramp lowered, they were surrounded. Ethan raised his hand slowly, eyes flicking between the soldiers. Vena didn't move. A low, heavy voice cut through the tension. "Bring them." The soldiers parted, and there, at the end of the great hall, stood King Zorvak. The Xalfar ruler was a titan of a being, his golden eyes sharp as daggers, his black armor glinting under the eerie blue lights of the chamber. He did not need to shout to command attention. His presence alone was absolute. Vena lifted her chin, refusing to show weakness as they were led forward. She would not bow. Not to him. Not anymore. The king's gaze swept over her, then shifted to Ethan. His expression barely changed, but his disgust was obvious. "A human," he said, voice filled with quiet rage. "Is this what you have fallen to?" Vena's fists clenched. "I have fallen to nothing." The king stepped closer, towering over both of them. "You defy your people. You disgrace your bloodline. And now you carry an abomination." Ethan stiffened beside her, but Vena spoke first. "This abomination is stronger than you think." Something flickered in the king's eyes, a flash of something unreadable. But then his face hardened. "I will not allow this." His gaze flicked to Ethan. "The human dies. You will return to Salfar Prime, where your child will be removed." The words were like ice in Vena's veins. "No." The single word echoed through the hall. The king's expression darkened. Vena took a step forward. "I am not a child to be commanded anymore. I am not your political tool. I am not your property." The soldiers in the room shifted uncomfortably. No one had ever spoken to the king this way. Ethan's voice was steady when he spoke. "You don't have control over her anymore." The king turned to him, his expression unreadable. Then, with a flick of his wrist, Ethan was on his knees, gasping for air. The invisible force crushed down on him, his body trembling under the sheer weight of the pressure. Vena moved without thinking. "Stop." And then, something shifted. A wave of energy burst from her body, sending a pulse through the air. The power in the king's hand shattered, and Ethan fell forward, coughing. The hall was dead silent. Vena's breathing was heavy, her heart hammering in her chest. Her hands trembled. The Salfar soldiers stared at her. The king took a step back. For the first time in her life, her father looked at her not with disappointment, but with something else. Fear. The escape begins. Ethan gritted his teeth and pushed himself up. Well, that was new. Vena barely heard him. Her mind raced. That energy, where had it come from? The Xalfar had no such abilities, and yet, in that moment when she had tried to protect Ethan, something inside her had awakened. But there was no time to think about it. The soldiers hesitated. They had seen the king's power fail. They had seen his authority challenged. And Vena acted. She grabbed Ethan's wrist. "Run." They moved fast. Blaster fire erupted behind them, bolts of plasma screaming through the air as they dodged through the corridors. The halls of the Salfar flagship were vast, twisting, but Vena knew them well. They tore through the docking bay. Ethan shoved a guard aside, grabbing a weapon from a fallen soldier. Vena didn't need one. She could feel the energy inside her now, pulsing with each step. Ethan, ship. He saw it, a smaller Xalfar scout vessel, fast and agile. He bolted toward it, Vena close behind. The alarms screamed through the ship. The king was coming. They reached the vessel, slamming the doors shut behind them. Ethan jumped into the pilot's seat. "I really hope this thing flies the way I think it does." Vena sat beside him, her fingers tensing over the controls. "It does." They exchanged a single glance. And then they launched. A new war begins. The scout ship shot out of the docking bay, twisting through enemy fire as the Salfar fleet scrambled to respond. Explosions ripped through the air, human and Salthar ships still locked in battle. Ethan gritted his teeth. We won't make it to the human alliance. Vena's hands trembled. She knew he was right. No human ship was coming to save them. But maybe she didn't need saving. She closed her eyes. The energy inside her, the same force that had broken her father's grip, swelled. She didn't know what it was, but she could feel it responding to her. She reached for it, and for the first time in her life, she was free. The battle for the future. The Salthar scout ship tore through the chaos of battle, its sleek frame twisting between laser fire and exploding wreckage. The human and Salthar fleets clashed in a brutal storm of destruction, the void filled with the glow of burning ships. Ethan gritted his teeth, hands tight on the controls. This is bad. Really, really bad. Vena sat beside him, her mind racing. She could feel the pulse of power still lingering inside her, the strange energy that had shattered her father's control. It felt raw, untamed, alive. She had no idea what it meant, but she knew one thing. Her father was coming, and this war wouldn't end until one side was gone. The king's last move. Inside the Salthar flagship, King Zorvax stood on the bridge, his golden eyes burning with fury. His soldiers watched him carefully, uneasy after what had happened in the throne room. He had felt it. The pulse of energy. It had been Vena. But Salthar did not have abilities like that. No one did, except perhaps the child she carried. Zorvak's jaw clenched. He had thought the child was a weakness, a mistake, an abomination that needed to be erased. But now, a far worse thought crept into his mind. What if this child was a weapon? What if the combination of human and Salthar was something beyond either species? The king straightened. Prepare the annihilation cannons. The crew froze. A deep, terrified silence filled the bridge. Your Majesty, one of the officers hesitated, his voice uncertain. The annihilation cannons will destroy the human fleet entirely. The planet nearby will be. Zorvak's eyes flickered dangerously. Are you questioning me? The officer lowered his head immediately. No, my lord. The command was given. The annihilation cannons began charging. The entire battlefield shifted. Human commanders saw it immediately. The giant energy build up on the Salthar flagship. They had seen that weapon before. It didn't just destroy ships, it erased them. If it fired, the human alliance would be wiped out in seconds. There would be no survivors. The moment of choice. Ethan saw the warning lights flash across the ship's screen. His stomach dropped. Oh no. What? Vena turned to him. Ethan's hands shook slightly. They're powering up their planet killer. Vena's blood ran cold. If the cannon fired, it wouldn't just kill the human alliance. It would destroy entire planets. She had always known her father was ruthless. But this wasn't war. This was genocide. Her hands tightened into fists. She had spent her entire life under her father's rule. She had been raised to believe in his power, his law, his way of thinking. But now she saw him for what he truly was. A coward. A man so afraid of change, so afraid of a world he couldn't control, that he would rather burn it all to ash than allow something new to exist. Her child was proof of something greater, and her father wanted to erase that proof. She would not let him. The final stand. Vena's breathing steadied. The strange energy inside her, the same power that had broken her father's grip, was growing. It wasn't just hers. It was coming from her child. For the first time in her life, she felt it. A connection. The power called to her, begging to be unleashed. And this time, she did not resist. She closed her eyes. The ship shook violently. Ethan yelped. What are you doing? A shockwave of invisible energy pulsed from Vena's body, expanding outward like a ripple through space. The Salthar warships hesitated, their systems flickering for just a moment. On the Salthar flagship, King Zorvak's eyes widened. And then, everything changed. Vena's voice rang out, clear and powerful. "Stand down." Her words carried force. Not just sound, a command. Across the battlefield, Zalfar soldiers froze. Pilots hesitated. The fleet's systems glitched. The king's control wavered. He felt it, the energy washing over his empire. Something was changing. His power, his rule, his very existence. For the first time in his life, he felt helpless. And he hated it. With a roar of rage, he slammed his fist onto the control panel. Fire the cannon. The ship's weapons began to glow. But Vena was already moving. She reached out, not with her hands, but with her mind. The power inside her rushed outward, colliding with the Zalfar flagship. And then, the annihilation cannon shattered. The entire weapon exploded, a burst of energy ripping through the warship, sending it spiraling backward. The Zalfar fleet reeled in shock. Ethan's jaw dropped. Holy! The battlefield fell into silence. For the first time in history, the Zalfar had lost. And Vena, she had won. The end of an era. The human alliance took advantage of the confusion. They pushed forward, forcing the Zalfar fleet to retreat. The battle was over. The flagship, now damaged beyond function, drifted in space. Vena stood at the ship's window, watching the remnants of her father's empire flee. Ethan came up beside her. "You did it." She turned to him, something unreadable in her gaze. "We did it." She placed a hand over her abdomen. The energy inside her was calm now. She didn't know what the future held. But she knew one thing. Her child would be more than just a symbol. Her child would be the beginning of something new. The king's choice. The vastness of space stretched before them, filled with the shattered remains of a battle that had changed everything. The once mighty Zalfar fleet, feared across the galaxy, now drifted in retreat, its warships limping back toward the edges of their empire. The human alliance, battered but victorious, watched in stunned silence as the impossible had unfolded before them. But inside the ruined Zalfar flagship, in the heart of its command center, King Zorvak sat in silence. For the first time in his long reign, he felt something he had never known before. Defeat. The broken throne. The Zalfar war throne had never felt so cold. The once grand bridge of the flagship, once filled with the hum of power, was now eerily quiet. His warriors, once unshakable, stood in tense uncertainty. His daughter's voice still echoed in his mind. "Stand down." Her words had carried power. Not just defiance, not just anger. Something deeper. Something older than their empire. Zorvak clenched his jaw. His golden eyes narrowed. She had tapped into something that even he, the king of the Zalfar, could not control. A power not from his empire, nor from the humans, but from something new. His grandchild. The thought sent a wave of rage through him. He had spent his life shaping the future of his people, ensuring their dominance. And yet, in one battle, the unthinkable had happened. Not only had his daughter survived, but she had defied him. And now, for the first time in centuries, the future of the Zalfar was uncertain. Vena's return. Aboard the Human Alliance's flagship, Ethan and Vena stood side by side, watching the Zalfar fleet disappear into the void. Vena exhaled slowly. "It's over." Ethan glanced at her. "Is it?" She didn't answer, because she knew it wasn't. Her father had retreated, but he wasn't gone. And she knew that as long as he lived, there would always be a shadow over her child's future, unless she ended it herself. Her fingers curled into a fist. "I need to see him." Ethan blinked. "Wait. What?" She turned to him, her violet eyes steady. "He's still alive, and he will never stop hunting us until I face him." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "Vena, we just barely made it out of there. You want to go back?" "Yes." Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Then he sighed. "Yeah, that sounds exactly like something you'd say." She tilted her head. Is that bad? Ethan chuckled. It's what I love about you. She blinked. Love. The word felt strange, but warm, like something she wanted to hold on to. But there was no time for that now. She turned to the human commander. I need a ship. The commander hesitated. Are you sure? I am. And so, with one final mission, they set off toward the Zalthar flagship. The King and the Hare. The damaged Zalthar flagship was eerily quiet when Vena stepped aboard. The once proud soldiers did not stop her. They had seen what she had done. They had felt the shift in power. And they knew their king's reign was at an end. She walked through the great halls, Ethan beside her, his hand hovering over his weapon, but not drawing it. Not yet. Finally, they entered the throne room. King Zorvac sat upon his throne, his once imposing figure now heavy with the weight of failure. The moment his golden eyes met Vena's, the room seemed to freeze. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, the king exhaled. You have come to kill me. Vena's jaw tightened. No. Zorvac frowned. Then why are you here? She stepped closer. To give you a choice. Ethan tensed beside her, ready for an attack. But Vena stood firm, her gaze locked onto her father's. Zorvac let out a bitter laugh. You think I have a choice? Vena lifted her hand. The air shifted. A faint glow of unseen energy rippled around her fingertips, the same power that had shattered his control before. Zorvac's breath caught. He wasn't looking at his daughter anymore. He was looking at the future. And for the first time, he felt something stranger than defeat. He felt uncertainty. Vena's voice was quiet but firm. You spent your life believing that only pure Zalthar blood could rule, that anything else was a disgrace, that strength meant power, and power meant control. She placed a hand over her abdomen. My child proves you wrong. Zorvac's hands curled into fists. That child is not Zalthar. Vena's eyes hardened. That child is more than Zalthar. The word hung between them like a blade. Zorvac closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, something had changed. He knew. He knew that he could not win. And more than that, he knew that his time was over. The new path. The king slowly stood from his throne. His golden eyes met Vena's. I will not surrender, he said softly. Vena did not look away. I am not asking you to. A silence stretched between them. Then, Zorvac knelt. Gasps echoed through the chamber as the Zalthar king lowered his head. I do not understand this future, he admitted, but I see that I cannot stop it. He looked up at her. What will you do? Vena took a slow breath. I will lead. Not as you did. Not through fear. Not through war. She reached out. And if you wish, you may stand beside me. Zorvac's eyes searched hers. For the first time, he saw not a failure, not a weakness, but a ruler. A new era. He bowed his head. Then I surrender to my daughter. Vena exhaled. It was over. The war was over. A new age had begun. And at the heart of it all was a miracle child.